Our Free and Equal segment tonight. On September 17th, 1987, the Constitutional Convention came to a close. From within those walls was created a document unlike any written by mankind before. A document that enshrined for all men fundamental rights that cannot be withheld or revoked by an overbearing government. This document, our Constitution, is the longest living constitution of a free people in history. Yet today, only 37% of Americans can name a single right of the 5 protected in our First Amendment. With me now to break it down, author of A Debt Against the Living, An Introduction to Originalism, Elon Werman. Elon, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, this is somewhat of a shocking statistic. I expect something like this to come from college campuses, but not from the overall population of American adults. 37% of Americans, that is nearly 4 out of every 10 Americans, can't name even one of the 5 rights in our First Amendment. Elon, what does this say about our society?
Yeah, well, I'm here to tell you that the problem is even worse. Right? We always lament the lack of civics education in this country, and this statistic is just one example. But I'm here to share with you that I think the problem is even worse. It's that even when students and kids are taught about civics, right, in colleges and law schools, they're taught all the wrong things. They're not taught the right way to think about the founding, right? They're taught that our founders were just white, male landowners and slave owners, and that because of that, we can't admire and venerate their achievement in the Constitution and in the First Amendment, for example. But I think that's the wrong way to go about this, right? We, of course, we can't sugarcoat the founders, right? They were imperfect, they were white, they were male, they were landowners, and most of them were slave owners. But that's not why we celebrate them. That's not why we celebrate them. We celebrate them because they overcame these historical limitations in important ways. They didn't invent slavery. They didn't invent the exclusion of women. They didn't invent the exclusion of the poor. We celebrate them because their achievement was writing for the first time in a foundational national document that all men are created equal. As a result of which writing, by the way, half the states abolished slavery between 1776 and 1789. The founders' achievement was creating, as you said, the first free government of the modern world, committed to the principle of equality under law. Remember, the Constitution abolished property requirements for holding federal office. It abolished titles of nobility. It abolished hereditary privileges. These things had never been done before. We have, of course, we have progressed since the founders' time. But I think we've done so largely because we stand on the shoulders of their achievement. But we're not taught to think like that anymore.
No, and it's a shame that we're not. I mean, that was beautifully said right there, but I think it can be encapsulated, and we can bust the liberal narrative that the founding fathers were racist or sexist or backwards. They were, in a sense. No one's arguing that they weren't, but the Constitution that they wrote, that was not.
That's exactly right. And we have to be wary. There was a famous historian that cautioned against the enormous condescension of posterity. We think that we're so much more enlightened and so much more progressive, and in many respects we are. In many respects we are. But that's because we stand on the shoulders of what came before. We have to judge the acts of the founders within the context of their time. They weren't perfect, right? But we celebrate them for what they overcame, the progress that they made against those historical conditions. And as you said, the Constitution they wrote was for all people. It was enduring. And they knew we would progress. They knew we would evolve, which is why they left so much to the democratic process. That's, by the way, one of the great geniuses of the Constitution. It doesn't actually require very much. It left so much for the democratic process precisely because the founders knew that we would evolve and progress over time. And that's an extraordinary achievement.
Right, to recognize that ingenuity that would be to come if the American freedom experiment actually worked out. Elon, how did we get to the point where children aren't taught these things that you're saying, or that's in your book? Great book, by the way, I read it over the weekend. How did we get, as a society, as an education system, how did we get to the point where we're only teaching children that the founding fathers are racist without the caveat that their work is not racist, and we're not teaching the value of the Constitution to us in this day and age?
Yeah, well, it's a long story. It has in part to do with progressivism, but that's the core of it. It's look at what the reaction to the Woodrow Wilson statute at Princeton, right? Even a progressive hero right? And progressives were trying to change the name of the Woodrow Wilson School because Woodrow Wilson was a racist. And of course, we have to recognize that. Yes, he was a racist, for example, but many progressives shouldn't celebrate him because of that, right? We forget that we stand on the shoulders of giants that came before us who weren't perfect because of the context in which they live. And so I think to answer your question, it goes to modern day arrogance. Again, we think that we are so enlightened and so progressive, and in many respects, we are, but we are all of those things because of the work that came before us. And I think the problem is we forget about that. We forget how things were in 1787, right? What an incredible innovation the Constitution was. As you said, the first free government in the modern world. That was a huge innovation. But we're not taught to think like that because we think so much about our own superiority and our own advances. And I think we have to keep that in perspective. We have to be more measured and sober when we compare ourselves to the past.
No, you're absolutely right. And the other thing, and I think you bring this up, both of us bring this up by our respective identities, and I put that in air quotes there. The fact, that we're both millennials, we're both conservatives, you're gay, I'm a young woman. To the liberals, both of our identities are baffling because they think they have this stronghold, this monopoly on both of our demographics here. But the thing about the Constitution is it's actually inclusive because it is a framework that codifies freedom and doesn't codify any sort of religion, any sort of morality, any sort of rules, regulations, and traditions of the day. It just codifies truth, right and wrong about mankind, regardless of where you appear in history. Because of that, it's actually the most inclusive form of government in the history of the entire world. And liberals, when they talk about intolerance, when they talk about bigotry, when they talk about hate, when they talk about bullying, they neglect to remember that we're lucky that we live under a constitution such as the one we have, because if not, none of us would be included at many points in history. Ilan, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it. And I encourage our viewers to go read your book. It's very good. All right.